We typically know who are the most powerful Pokemon of each generation. The Pokemon that are OU, high usage rate. Pokemon that are the face of their competitive generation. I'm talking Gen 1 Tauros or Gen 2 Snorlax. But who exactly are the worst Pokemon of each gen? That's what I'm going to figure out. We are taking into account usage rates, yes, but also their places on the viability rankings and just overall, were they actually worth having on a team? I'm taking into consideration only how good they were in that specific generation, and it has to be a Pokemon introduced in that gen as well. So if I'm talking about the worst Pokemon in Gen 2, I'm not going to be bringing up a Pokemon that was in Gen 1. Number 1, Beedrill. This was probably the easiest generation, obviously, because there is the least amount of Pokemon, and it's probably not super surprising if you like Generation 1. Beedrill has a poison bug typing, and in Generation 1, there are certain types with complete lack of moves. Some of these types include fighting, ghost, or bug, or poison. The only stat move he can run is Twin Needle, and he usually needs to run 2 setup moves in Agility and Swords Dance to deal any type of damage. However, that is very situational, because setting up once without getting O-code is already unrealistic, so to land 2 setup moves is asking way too much of this very frail Pokemon. Alongside that, Psychic is one of the best typings in the generation, and being weak to it is a death sentence. There's only one Pokemon in Gen 1 OU with a Psychic type weakness, that being Gengar. But that's also because he's immune to the other best typing in the game, which is normal with his Ghost typing. Beedrill also has a base stat total that is incredibly low. It's lower than a lot of fully evolved Pokemon or single stage Pokemon, barely outclassing Ditto and Farfetch. His highest stat is his 80 attack stat, and his lowest is his 45 defense and special attack. He gets outclassed by Pokemon like Venomoth, who have niches as sleepers and outspeed him. Beedrill only has a 90 base speed stat after all. Victory Bell, who has access to both Sleep Powder and Wrap, which is overpowered in Generation 1, is a much better pick than him, and it's walled by Pokemon like Abra, Nidoking, Pinsir, and Fearow. With 4 weaknesses and non-existent defensive stats, even when considering maxed out stats of Generation 1, Beedrill has one of the most unimpressive stat spreads of all time. The reason he's the worst Pokemon of this generation is mostly because he is just useless, and his viability hinges on mostly your opponent misplaying and being trash. Generation 2, Unown. Beedrill was so bad, I didn't know how I was going to find another Pokemon with a similar level of just terribleness, but it became quickly apparent that it was going to be Unown. In terms of gimmicks, Unown has one of the worst ones, which is that it can only learn one move, and that being Hidden Power, which is a base 60 power move. Of course, because you can't have multiple copies of the same move, Unown can only run one move, which is crazy. He doesn't even have a good typing. He even has a really low base stat total of 336, with his lowest stat being 48 and his highest being 72, which was so much worse than I remember. It's so funny, I don't even know what to say. He's outclassed by, I kid you not, every single Psychic-type Pokemon, probably even Little Cup Pokemon, as they can at least use Eviolite. In later on generations, it goes on to get Levitate, but in Gen 2, Levitate does not exist, so it doesn't even have a good ability. Not only is he the worst Pokemon in Gen 2, but probably the worst Pokemon of all time. Generation 3, Spinda. Spinda has the most horrible traits you could ever want from any underachieving Pokemon. Low base stat total, 60 base stat across the board specifically, which means he can't excel in any specific department, and it results in a 360 base stat total. Abilities wise, nowadays it has access to Own Tempo, Tangled Feet, and Contrary. However, in Generation 3, he only had access to Own Tempo, as hidden abilities weren't introduced until Gen 3. Own Tempo is a fairly niche ability which prevents you from getting confused, but it's one of those rare status conditions because no one is running Water Pulse or Confuse Ray. The only way Spinda could have really been useful is if you take advantage of her access to Hypnosis, Calm Mind, and Battle Pass. However, if you really want a Hypnosis user, there's Gengar, and Battle Pass was banned in many generations, just not in Gen 3. So this is a pretty significant thing, you would think, being able to pass off Calm Mind or just use the move in general. But the thing is that if you want a Baton Passer, Celebi and Jolteon are right there, literally. Beyond that, you can give him a choice and set, and that takes advantage of his normal type moves, like Double Edge. But it's not like Double Edge off a 60 base physical attack will do any damage, even if it's Stab. If you really want a normal physical attacker, you could go for Snorlax, Swellow, or even Slacking, who is UUBL this generation. Spinda gives you absolutely no reason to ever choose it over literally anyone ever else created by Game Freak ever. Gen 4, Kricketune. It's no surprise that this list will have some bug types. A large majority of bug types are found in the earlier routes because it is naturally weaker and have lower base stat totals, etc., makes for a good Pokemon to catch early on. However, usually you ditch it, there's no reason. But in terms of weak bug types, like Beedrill for example, Kricketune really takes the cake. Besides his iconic Scream, Kricketune has nothing going for it. Nowadays, it at least gets access to Sticky Web. However, that move did not exist previous to Generation 6. So what did people run on him? Well, a simple combo of Swords Dance and 3 offensive moves. However, as much as on another Pokemon, Swords Dance plus Stab X Scissor could be significant, on Kricketune, 85 base stats meant absolutely nothing. That's pretty sad. His lowest being his defensive stat at 51. Totaling out at 384 base stats. Kricketune currently has Technician, and his ability Technician is, to his credit, good, used most notably by Scizor or Marshadow, using it to boost Bullet Punch, but he didn't have that in Gen 4, and Gen 4's only ability is Swarm, the bug-type version of Torrent or Blaze. But it's so useless on him because, yeah, so what, you get a boost once your HP stat is at 1/3 or less. He will probably die because he is unbelievably frail, and even if he doesn't die, it doesn't matter. His attack stat is so bad. If you want a good bug type, the best to pick is obviously Scizor. Better typing, better move pool, etc. Beyond that, other Pokemon like Heracross or Yanmega are also an option. Generation 5. Now we're moving on to another bug type who will probably one of the worst types I've ever seen in Bug and Grass. Leavanny has a total of 6 weaknesses, 2 of them having a quadruple super effectiveness on it. Like most bad bug types nowadays, he has access to Sticky Web. However, back in Generation 5, that very much wasn't the case. Leavanny has a bit more variety to her sets than the other bug types, as she has access to a rather interesting stab typing. However, like I said, Bug Grass is not good. Yeah, it means that you're super effective against Ground, Water, Rock, Dark, and Psychic, and in Generation 5, it was filled with Pokemon with those typings, like Latios, Latios, Politoed, Starmie, etc. However, she is on this list, so clearly she had a few factors holding her back. Number 1 has to be that even though offensively this typing is interesting, like I said in the beginning, this typing is really bad because defensively it is atrocious. It's weak to Flying, Poison, Rock, Bug, Fire, and Ice. Now this wouldn't be such a big problem if Leavanny was, say, a fast physical attacker, but she is not. She has the base stat total of 490, and her highest stat being her attack stat at 103, and her lowest being her special attack and special defense at 70. Now because this is a higher base stat total than the other Pokemon, you might think, well, that's kind of impressive, but don't be fooled, this does suck. She has 3 abilities and Swarm, Overcoat, and Chlorophyll. And Swarm, as we talked about, boosts bug-type moves at less than 1/3 of your HP. Chlorophyll doubles speed and sun, and Overcoat means you're immune to damages from Sandstorm or Hail. Now, these are all very good abilities, especially within the context of Generation 5 OU, where weather is super common. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, as sun teams were nerfed. And yes, sand is still very common, with Tyranitar and Hippowdon being the most common setters, but who cares if Leavanny doesn't take any damage from it? She can't do anything while on the field. These small buffs may be significant on a Pokemon that's much better, but on a Pokemon that you would never use, it doesn't really matter. Usually people would run Life Orb sets with Leaf Blade, X Scissor, and whatever 2 filler moves you want to use. But it doesn't really matter because, like I said, horrible typing, really bad stats, she is not going anywhere. Generation 6, Meowstic.
Mimi, wait! Stay away from her!
Meowstic has one of the most underwhelming monotypings in Mono-Psychic. Her highest stat is 101, and her lowest is 48. There is really only one function for Meowstic that she can have, which is setting up screens. She is obviously not good for anything otherwise. She has 3 abilities, 2 of which I would say are actually fairly respectable. Infiltrator and Prankster, the third one being Keen-Eye, which isn't too useful. Infiltrator allows you to bypass screens, and Prankster allows you to use non-damaging moves with priority, which is perfect for what she's trying to achieve, like I said, setting up screens. However, Pokemon who set up screens usually have to be on the bulkier side, so they can come back and reset them. However, Meowstic is anything but bulky. Like I said, her stats are very underwhelming. They are deplorable, just truly pathetic. So when you consider the fact that the niche that she's trying to fill requires attributes that she just does not have, she's one of the worst Pokemon in Generation 6, not having any real reason for you to use her. Generation 7. This Pokemon took some time to decide, but I decided on the base form of Oricorio. Granted, the other forms of Oricorio aren't as pathetic, but for this one, she takes the cake. Now, Oricorio leaves a lot to be desired. Nowadays, Oricorio line isn't as bad because of Terra and the access to Quiver Dance, but this was pre-Terra, pre-Gen 9. They had a much harder time being viable, gets deplorable stats, and a deplorable typing, like every single other Pokemon on this list. The only way to read the user is to set up via Calm Mind, boosting her special attack and special defense, and then using Revelation Dance. But remember, this is pre-Generation 8, so that means that she had to deal with a flying fire typing and no heavy-duty boots. Bad typing, no heavy-duty boots, bad stats resulted in her being ridiculously underwhelming and nothing more than a gimmick Pokemon. Because let's face it, pre-Generation 8, if you're a fire flying type and your name isn't Ho-Ho or Charizard Y, you're not getting used. It is such a frail Pokemon, you don't need a check for it or a counter. He'll probably just die because, again, his stats leave a lot to be desired. Generation 8, Calyrex. I had previously named Calyrex as the worst Pokemon of all time, and that's honestly false. He is not the worst Pokemon of all time. Like I said, that goes to Unown. However, he is the worst Pokemon of Generation 8. Which is funny, considering that in VGC is considered a restricted Pokemon, but Calyrex is fairly underwhelming for multiple reasons. First, let's look at his typing. His typing is neither good offensively or defensively. It has a total of 7 weaknesses in Flying, Poison, Bug, Ghost, Fire, Ice, and Dark, that Bug weakness being quadruple. It has 80 base stats across the board, and it doesn't excel at anything. In its debut generation, it was in PU, and if you want a good Psychic Grass type Pokemon for some reason, then look no further than Executor. Better stats, better abilities, and a sleeper. Its ability is also useless and a nerve. It prevents the opposing Pokemon from eating their berries. So that's incredibly niche, essentially useless. The only way to make it viable is to use Agility and Calm Mind, Beedrill style, which is insane, because with all of those weaknesses and frail stats, there is no way you would actually be able to get those 2 setup moves. Its unviability is actually off the charts. Last one is Generation 9, Toedscool. This was a bit harder because I don't think any of the Generation 9 Pokemon are downright atrocious or as atrocious as the other. I think it's partly to do with the fact that power creep has affected even low to F tier Pokemon, but I still got my pick in Toedscool. Besides looking like the living embodiment of herpes, he is a Pokemon with a useless ability. He also has a typing which makes him super vulnerable to multiple typings, specifically Ice, with a quadruple weakness to it. His stat spread is also definitely unimpressive. It's the most impressive we've seen so far, but when you look at it objectively, it's not getting him anywhere. His highest stat is a special defense, but with a horrible defensive typing, he's not going to be tanking any hits. He is a Pokemon that tries to fill a role which his typing doesn't agree with, and there are plenty of those to choose from. If you want a ground grass type, then a better option would honestly be Torterra, access to Shell Smash. And if you want a special tank, literally pick anyone else who actually has a good defensive typing. His only redeeming fact is the fact that he has access to Rapid Spin. But he is too fragile to actually be a reliable rapid spinner, as he would constantly need to switch in and tank hits, which he is not built for. That was my list for the weakest Pokemon of each generation. I know this is to some degree subjective, so please tell me on the worst Pokemon of each gen. Thank you.